A single overhead bulb cast long shadows across the wooden floor of the old auction house in rural Montana. The hour was late. So late, in fact, that one might think only illicit transactions took place in this hidden corner. Rows of seats, some broken, some repaired, faced a small stage. On that platform, separated from the crowd by a flimsy wooden rail, stood a German Shepherd. His once proud posture now trembled with fear. Deep scars ruined the shiny coat. The animal's eyes flickered with a mixture of anxiety and resignation, as though he had long since given up hope. A faint hush fell whenever the dog lifted his head. You could hear the whispers. "Damaged goods," they murmured among themselves. "Won't fetch much. I bet he has a fierce personality." The auctioneer, a tall man with calloused hands, tapped his gavel a few times. He was clearly uncomfortable having to sell a live animal in such poor condition. The dog's breath came out in ragged puffs, matching the swirl of dust motes in the weak light. If not for the meager profit he might bring, the German Shepherd might have been tossed aside altogether. But there he was, the center of a spectacle, trembling under the weight of countless uncaring eyes. In contrast to the excitement of the auction room, Jonathan was reading the local newspaper under the fluorescent glow of a table lamp in his modest apartment. Headlines about farming accidents and community bake-offs normally filled the pages, but today his attention snagged on a small article tucked away near the bottom of page 4. It told a heartbreaking story of a German Shepherd that had been found tied to a stake, emaciated, covered in bruises, and apparently rescued for auction by a local kennel that specialized in second chance adoptions. Jonathan swallowed hard, pressing his fingertips to the lines of print. He was a recently discharged veteran, having returned from overseas service only a few weeks earlier. Every story of suffering animals stirred something profound in him, but this one, more so. The article included a grainy photo of the German Shepherd, a haunted look in the dog's eyes, scarred muzzle, posture that spoke of anguish. The next day on the way, Jonathan made a stop at a local vet clinic, having read that the veterinarian who treated the German Shepherd also worked there. He asked for Dr. Maria Lopez, a woman known for her compassionate approach to wounded animals. In her cluttered office that smelled faintly of antiseptic, Dr. Lopez explained the dog's unfortunate backstory. "He served in a military K-9 unit," she told Jonathan, pulling out a set of pictures showing the German Shepherd as a younger, vibrant pup. "You see him here on the training field, strong and focused. But later, he fell into the hands of some truly cruel trainers, people who should never have been allowed near a dog, much less one this special. They subjected him to brutal methods designed to break him." A wave of empathy poured over Jonathan. He thanked Dr. Lopez for her time. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he continued toward the auction house, the dog's tragic story playing on repeat in his mind. When Jonathan arrived, he stepped into the throng of bidders gathered around the auction block. As the auctioneer raised his gavel, a hush fell over the crowd, and murmurs broke out. "He looks dangerous," one whispered, while another said, "Not worth the trouble." Yet a few voices hinted at possibility, remarking, "That might be a good guard dog if trained properly." The starting bid was a modest $50, and initially, no one dared to raise their hand. Then a man in a worn-out coat scratched his stubbly chin and mockingly declared, "I'll give 20, even bid below the meager opening price." The auctioneer glared at him, disapproving of the flippant bid, while the rest of the crowd remained largely indifferent. Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest as memories of the dog's suffering and his own relentless battles with PTSD surged through him. With quiet determination, he lifted his hand and said firmly, 100. Heads turned and an astonished murmur rippled through the room. Why pay double for a battered dog? A middle-aged woman scoffed, while another grumbled that the animal was worthless. The auctioneer, clearly relieved to see a serious offer, raised his gavel once more. The man in the tattered coat countered with $150, his arrogance evident. Jonathan took a deep breath, swallowed his anxiety, and boldly countered, $200. Silence fell as no one else dared to continue, and with a final bang of the gavel, the auctioneer declared, "Sold, to the gentleman in the back." Jonathan exhaled, a mix of relief and trepidation warring within him. He could feel the eyes of the crowd, some pitying, others scornful. Yet he knew he had rescued the dog from a fate of further misery, offering it a chance at a new beginning. Approaching the stage, Jonathan noticed the German Shepherd trembling more visibly now that the bidding was over and the next steps loomed. The dog eyed Jonathan with apprehension. Each movement around the dog, people shuffling, voices rising, made the animal shrink back, lips curling into a silent, fearful snarl. Jonathan halted a few feet away, adopting the calm stance he had learned in the military, shoulders back, breathing steady. He knew well how to approach a frightened creature. He slowly crouched, lowering himself to the dog's level, offering an open palm and letting his voice drop to a soothing murmur. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The German Shepherd's ears twitched, one half-missing ear folding, as though straining to interpret Jonathan's intention. The menacing edge in the dog's posture remained, but there was something else, a faint stirring of curiosity or perhaps recognition of a familiar energy. The dog let out a low warning growl that vibrated in Jonathan's chest. The crow's feet at the corners of Jonathan's eyes tightened. He knew the dog's reaction was born out of fear rather than true aggression. Keeping his hand extended and making no sudden movements, Jonathan inched a bit closer. The dog's eyes flickered. The hackles on its neck rose, then lowered. A subtle change, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Jonathan felt it. It was as though the dog sensed the sincerity emanating from him, the quiet empathy that came from a man who had also been hurt and was trying to find his way back. Jonathan slowly lifted a slip lead, easing the loop over the dog's head. The German Shepherd offered a soft whine, part protest, part fear, but he allowed it. The scars stood out in stark relief under the dim lights. Jonathan gently brushed a trembling hand across the battered fur. The dog flinched, but he didn't growl again. Jonathan's house was modest, tucked away at the edge of rolling farmland. A leaning fence surrounded a yard dotted with patches of overgrown grass, and the porch light flickered like it was on its last bulb. It was not much, but it was quiet. It was safe. The drive from the auction house took nearly an hour, during which the German Shepherd lay in the back seat, panting nervously. Jonathan drove slowly. Winter air reduces visibility. Upon arriving, he parked in the gravel driveway, then carefully led the dog inside. The air in the small living room smelled faintly of old wood and freshly brewed coffee, Jonathan's attempt at staying awake when nightmares robbed him of rest. Gently, Jonathan guided the German Shepherd into a corner of the living room, where he had set up a soft bed and a dish of water. The dog edged backward, pressing against the wall as though ready to bolt, but the only escape was locked behind the man who now owned him. Jonathan knelt and placed the water bowl within reach. "This is a new chapter for both of us," he said softly. That night, the house felt still, yet thick with the atmosphere of change. The dog paced, nails clicking on the hardwood floor, flinching at every creak in the old pipes. Jonathan dozed fitfully on the couch. In one of those half-asleep moments, he heard the dog scramble at the front door, making a frantic sound somewhere between a bark and a whimper. Jonathan rose, heart pounding from the jolt of adrenaline that often accompanied his nightmares. He found the German Shepherd pressed against the corner, trembling. Every muffled noise from the fridge cycling on or the wind whistling outside triggered the dog's fear. "Hey," Jonathan murmured, voice hoarse from interrupted sleep. It's all right." He knelt down and gently stroked the dog's flank, feeling the ridges of scars beneath his palm. How many times has he had to fight or run to survive? Jonathan wondered, painfully aware that he too struggled with his own ghosts. By the following evening, a storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled across the wide Montana sky, shaking the windows in their frames. The German Shepherd paced with mounting panic. Lightning illuminated the sparse furniture in quick flashes of white. Each thunderclap sent the dog's tail down between his legs. Jonathan recognized that reaction all too well. Just as thunder could trigger the dog's memories of harsh training and brutal captivity, the noise also sparked Jonathan's flashbacks of mortar shells and gunfire. Instead of succumbing to his own anxiety, Jonathan pushed through his swirling emotions and kneeled beside the dog, wrapping an old blanket around its trembling shoulders. He leaned in, voice steady, nearly lost in the roar of the storm. "Shh, I've got you," he whispered. The dog's eyes were wide, pupils dilated with raw terror, but Jonathan continued stroking him in long, reassuring motions. "We'll get through this. Together," Jonathan thought, gently cradling the dog's head as the storm raged on. When the storm finally passed, Jonathan dedicated the following days to learning more about the dog's history. The local shelter provided the dog's old records, which Dr. Lopez had partially copied for reference. Scanning the documents, Jonathan saw photographs of the German Shepherd in uniform, helmet, harness, and a bright glint in his eyes. A proud service dog. That was before it all went wrong. Highlighted lines told the story of how, after his official retirement from military service, the dog had been transferred to a private training program. This program was supposed to prepare him for further security work, but instead, it funneled him into the hands of unscrupulous individuals who employed aggressive conditioning. The techniques detailed in the files made Jonathan's stomach turn. Electric shocks, starvation, isolation in dark cages. The pictures that followed showed the dog's steady decline, ribs jutting out, eyes clouding with despair, open wounds from repeated beatings. Further notes mentioned a man named Colonel Robert Daniels, once a respected figure in military circles, but whose reputation took a darker turn. Reports hinted at questionable training methods, some of which had apparently been hushed up. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the readout of these horrors burning in his mind. Fury coursed through him. The colonel's name was repeated multiple times, each instance linked to allegations of cruelty. The dog Jonathan now cared for had suffered at the hands of people who wore the same uniform he once did. Jonathan himself had joined the armed forces out of a desire to protect the vulnerable. Now here was a dog that had fallen victim to the very system that was meant to provide discipline and care. "This can't go unpunished," Jonathan muttered under his breath, tears of both anger and compassion stinging his eyes. Though he wasn't sure how to begin, he vowed he would bring justice for the German Shepherd, if only to prove that not all who served had such callous hearts. Early the next morning, as the sun's first rays filtered through the curtains, Jonathan crouched beside the German Shepherd and looked into his eyes. The dog held his gaze, still guarded, but less fearful. Jonathan had decided on a name: Valor. He said it aloud, carefully enunciating every syllable. "I'm calling you Valor. Because that's what you had once upon a time, and you still have it inside you. And it's what I need too. A reminder to keep fighting." The dog blinked, ears pricking slightly, as if curious about this new word. Jonathan repeated it, and though the dog didn't wag his tail, he no longer flinched. It was a start. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan and Valor settled into a routine. Gentle morning walks across the quiet farmland let Valor sniff the fence posts and watch the birds in the sky, tail occasionally wagging at small moments of serenity. Jonathan avoided sudden movements. He'd learned that even a simple gesture could trigger Valor's panic. But slowly, the dog's posture changed. He began to stand more confidently, eyes alert yet curious when Jonathan moved around the house. One morning, Jonathan woke up from yet another nightmare, sweat beading on his forehead. He felt a presence at the edge of the bed. Valor stood there, watching him with an almost concerned tilt of the head. The dog took a hesitant step forward, pressing his muzzle against Jonathan's outstretched hand. It was a moment of unmistakable trust. Jonathan stroked Valor's neck, feeling both sorrow and gratitude. Each of them was, in a way, healing the other. And in that small sunrise-lit bedroom, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope he hadn't known in ages. Word spread in the local community about Jonathan's decision to adopt the damaged ex-military dog from the shady auction house. Some folks remembered the dog's story, especially those who had read about it in the paper. Survivors of loss, veterans with PTSD, and kind-hearted townspeople began to drop by Jonathan's place, sometimes bringing supplies, dog blankets, chew toys, specialized treats. One older lady knitted a coat for Valor, embroidered with the word hero. Others helped Jonathan connect with local organizations that advocated for better treatment of service dogs. Evening gatherings at the local community center turned into informal support groups. People shared stories of how they had once encountered poorly trained or abused animals, or how they themselves had struggled with trauma. Out of these conversations, a humble but determined movement formed, aiming to push for reforms that would protect the rights of retired canines and service animals. Jonathan was astonished at how Valor's presence had galvanized a small but dedicated circle of supporters. Maybe, he thought, maybe this dog's suffering can lead to something good. However, not everyone welcomed Jonathan's newfound activism. News of his inquiries into Colonel Robert Daniels' training facility reached ears it shouldn't have. Late one afternoon, as Jonathan loaded dog food into the back of his old pickup, a sleek black SUV rolled up. 3 men stepped out. They wore identical jackets and carried themselves with a military bearing that suggested they had once answered to Colonel Daniels. One stepped forward, glancing down at Valor, who stood protectively at Jonathan's side. "I heard you're causing trouble for Colonel Daniels. That dog belongs in a kennel, not out here stirring up pity," he snarled, voice cold. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken, a prickle of old combat instincts. He straightened his shoulders, meeting the man's stare. "He belongs right here with me, and I'm not the one stirring trouble. You and your colonel did that when you tortured an animal." A tense silence stretched. Valor let out a low growl, body rigid, but Jonathan placed a comforting hand on his flank. Eventually, the men retreated, but not without a warning. "Let's stop this or the dog will disappear." The SUV sped off, leaving Jonathan rattled, yet somehow more resolved. If bullies like that were worried about him, it meant he was on the right track. The confrontation only strengthened the community's resolve. With backing from animal welfare organizations, local police, and citizens outraged by the cruelty, Jonathan helped organize a protest. Flyers circulated, hashtags took off on social media, and soon a crowd assembled outside a once esteemed training camp, now owned by Colonel Daniels' associates. Jonathan stood at the forefront, Valor at his side. People held signs that read, "Stop Canine Abuse," and "Service Dogs Deserve Better." News crews arrived, broadcasting the protest regionally and then nationally. Under the glaring cameras, former employees of Daniels began to step forward, divulging horrific accounts of the colonel's methods, electric shock treatments, starve, and more. Tears stained the faces of onlookers as they heard testimonies from soldiers whose beloved canine partners had been maimed under the colonel's watch. What started as a small local protest quickly turned into a full-blown movement. Pressure mounted on legislators to investigate. A call for nationwide reform echoed across social media and the nightly news. Courage swelled in the hearts of those who had once been afraid to confront such abuses. Valor was no longer just a dog. He was living evidence of the damage inflicted by cruelty and a living testament that it could be overcome, As the media frenzy gained momentum, something extraordinary happened. Donations poured in from animal lovers across the state, then across the country. Jonathan, encouraged by local organizations, decided to put these funds toward establishing a safe haven for dogs like Valor, those who had been retired from the military but fell through the cracks of the system. They found an abandoned piece of land near the outskirts of town. Applying for a building permit is also supported by local authorities. Volunteers showed up with shovels, lumber, and sweat equity. Former battered barns were repurposed into kennels and training spaces. The newly formed board of directors settled on a name: the Valor K9 Rehabilitation Center. The day of the center's grand opening was chilly, but bright sunlight bathed the open fields in warmth. Dozens of people came, many bringing their own rescued dogs. Dr. Maria Lopez cut the ceremonial ribbon alongside Jonathan, tears glistening in her eyes. Valor stood front and center, wearing a freshly groomed coat and exuding a quiet dignity. In that moment, cameras flashed wildly, capturing the German Shepherd's transformation from abused and terrified to proud and calm, a symbol of hope. One by one, other retired service dogs started arriving. Some were timid, some aggressive. Most wore scars of one kind or another. Slowly, thanks to specialized care and compassionate handling, they too began to trust again. The center offered therapy sessions for veterans suffering from PTSD who found healing in working with these traumatized animals. Mutual solace blossomed in every training session, every afternoon walk, every gentle pat of fur. While the Valor K9 Rehabilitation Center took root, investigations into Colonel Robert Daniels' practices intensified. Journalists have uncovered evidence of Colonel Daniels' extensive animal abuse. The revelations were shocking. The colonel's once sterling reputation among certain segments of the military community crumbled under the weight of evidence. Anonymous tipsters provided photos and videos that showed dogs yelping under electric shocks or forced to endure punishing drills without water. Politicians, spurred by the public's outrage, began drafting comprehensive legislation aimed at tightening regulations on private training facilities and ensuring strict penalties for abusers. In Montana, local government officials convened special hearings. Jonathan was invited to testify, his nerves rattling at the idea of speaking in a crowded courtroom. Still he rose, heart-pounding, and told Valor's story. He had seen Valor reduced to a lifeless husk of his former self. He spoke of the night storms that triggered both their terrors and how, with empathy and proper care, Valor had grown calmer, braver, more trusting. Some nights, after these hearings or interviews, Jonathan would return to the rehab center or his own modest home and just sit quietly with Valor. The dog would place his head on Jonathan's lap, a comforting weight. With every breath, Jonathan felt more certain that they were on the right path. No matter how harrowing the revelations became, legislative victories soon followed. Various states passed laws that standardized humane training methods for service dogs, allocated better retirement plans for military canines, and imposed serious penalties on those who violated these protocols. Coaches like Robert Daniels are under scrutiny, with some facing criminal charges. The center also expanded. What started as one field and a couple of wooden barns grew into a sprawling campus, complete with a veterinary wing, supervised by Dr. Lopez, housing for rescue dogs, and training arenas. A special memorial garden stood near the entrance, dedicated to service dogs who had fallen prey to cruelty or been lost in the line of duty. Amid these achievements, Jonathan found his own PTSD easing in subtle increments. Nightmares still haunted him, but when they did, he no longer felt so alone. Valor was there, always watchful and attuned. The movement persisted, weaving itself into the fabric of national consciousness. Laws and reforms protected service dogs from the minute they entered training to the day they drew their last breath. Each success story, each wagging tail, each sparkle of trust in a once fearful eye echoed the legacy of Jonathan and valor, a testament to what can happen when one person refuses to look away from cruelty and one dog dares to trust again. In the end, their shared journey was about more than just legal battles or high-profile protests. It was about second chances, about forging a bond so strong it could heal scars both visible and invisible. Jonathan and Valor had proven that sometimes, from the darkest places, the brightest lights emerge. And their story continued to remind the world that true valor lies not in what breaks you, but in how you choose to stand back up. Share your thoughts in the comment section below about Jonathan and Valor's inspiring journey to protect K9 dogs from cruel trainers. And don't forget to hit the like button to support us.